Now to the long-awaited book from two outstanding Washington Post Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists. I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's catastrophic final year, is out today, and it details the chaos that started with the coronavirus and ended with the insurrection of the Capitol on January 6th. And the co-authors join us now. Investigative reporter for The Washington Post and MSNBC contributor Carol Leonnig, and senior Washington correspondent for The Washington Post and political analyst for MSNBC and NBC News, Philip Rucker, joins us. And you both actually traveled at Donald Trump's invitation to Mar-a-Lago to speak with the former president. Among the many questions you asked concerned the events at the Capitol on January 6th, and you write in part this: I would venture to say I think it was the largest crowd I had ever spoken to before, Trump said. It was a loving crowd, too, by the way. There was a lot of love. In all fairness, the Capitol Police were ushering people in, Trump said. The Capitol Police were very friendly. They were hugging and kissing. You don't see that. There's plenty of tape on that. Okay, I don't even know where to begin, but why don't we back up? And Carol, if you could fill us in on why you think he invited you to Mar-a-Lago and allowed you guys to sit down and talk to him about all of this.
You know, Mika, I think that Phil and I both recognize, as you do, because of how long you've been chronicling this presidency, that Donald Trump loves an audience. And when we were coming to see him, he had really been stripped of some of his opportunities and audiences. No longer was he on the South Lawn talking to reporters every morning. He was off Twitter. And honestly, he wanted to get across his version of reality to us. And as he said, get the word out. Many of the things he said to us do not square with reality and do not square with the evidence that we have and facts that we've done in our reporting. But Donald Trump wants that alternate reality out there, and he wants to explain to the public that he really didn't lose, that he won Arizona and Pennsylvania and Michigan. He wants people to believe that the January 6th riot was a peaceful, loving event in which his supporters were just basically great, loving people. We all know that what we saw, which was that rioters were slamming flagpoles and batons and bear spray at police officers, and some of them died that day or the next day.
And Phil, when he said things like that, did you all push him? Did you say, with all due respect, that is exactly not what happened? People died, and this was an insurrection, among many other things. I mean, what was the conversation like, or was he allowed to just talk?
You know, Mika, we pushed him repeatedly in a number of different areas, including about his allegations of voter fraud. This is 2 months after he left office, and he was still filled with grievance about the fraud that he believes existed, or at least that he tries to persuade his supporters existed, when there's no evidence for it whatsoever. We also asked him why, as president, he thought it was okay for him to continually tell the American people things that were not true, to lie again and again and again. And he said to us, you know, there's a beautiful word, and it's called disinformation.
Hey, Carol, it's Willie. Congratulations, guys, on this book, which is just one scoop after another. I'm reading your piece in Vanity Fair that chronicles your interview on March 31st when you went down to Mar-a-Lago and sat with former President Trump. I'll begin at the end where he says, I actually enjoyed this. For some sick reason, I enjoyed it. Speaking of your interview. Carol, he goes through just about anybody you could criticize and criticizes them, down to, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, John McCain. We've heard these insults before. But what is your sense of why he wanted to sit with you for as long as he did, and what he needed to get into the record, despite, he always does this, his protest that you guys are unfair and that your previous book was fake news, etc.?
You know, Willie, I'm really glad you asked that question, and that final moment is one of our favorite as well. I mean, the former president is really actually being pretty aware of himself at that moment by saying, you know, I am addicted to your questions and your attention. It is a sickness in some respects. However, I would argue that part of the reason he sat with us for so long is because we were eager to hear his explanations. We were eager to hear his narrative of this incredible, consequential, and ultimately catastrophic year. We wanted him to have a chance to explain that. And mostly what he talked about is how often people around him failed him. I mean, he believes Bill Barr was addicted to the media and too weak to resist the criticism that he was facing, and that's why Bill Barr failed him. He argued that Mitch McConnell was stupid and lacked personality, and that this was a huge sort of yoke around his neck to have a Republican leader who was so fair to middling, I guess I'd say. The next thing that he argued was that Pence, his vice president, was weak and could have done more to protect the Constitution if he had followed Donald Trump's words. Now, of course, you know, a lot of people will disagree with the president about this, but I think it's so interesting. His narrative is basically that he alone was the brilliant genius and everyone else was an enemy or a weak paltry stand-in.
And here's what President Trump told you guys, quote, had Mike Pence had the courage to send it back to the legislatures, you would have had a different outcome, in my opinion. I think the Vice President of the United States must protect the Constitution of the United States. I don't believe he's just supposed to be a statue who gets these votes from the states and immediately hands them over. If you see fraud, then I believe you have an obligation to do one of a number of things. End quote from former President Trump. Phil, many people would say that Mike Pence did defend the Constitution that day, at least in that moment. President Trump, in your interview, also criticized the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, saying he didn't do enough. He goes after Chris Christie. He says Nikki Haley put out some nasty statements. I mean, the island is really shrinking around him. It's down to about Rudy Giuliani, Kevin McCarthy, and some immediate family members. But you guys have a passage in here in this Vanity Fair piece about President Trump committing to the lies with a straight face. And I encourage everybody to read this piece because, my goodness, he goes off on every conspiracy theory. I mean, if you had someone in your family speaking the way he speaks to you, you'd call an emergency meeting and say there's something wrong with Dad. What is your sense of whether he actually believes the garbage he's spewing or he needs it to be out there to tell himself or at least to tell his supporters that he did win?
You know, Willie, it's hard for us as journalists to get inside the head of Donald Trump, but he repeats these lies again and again so often that they might be true in his mind. And when you're down there talking to him, there's a distorted reality that he's presenting, not only to us, but to the dozens of guests that come to Mar-a-Lago every night for dinner and give him a standing ovation out on the patio at sunset. I mean, it's a really strange scene down there. And then you leave Mar-a-Lago and you realize what's happening in the world, the reality is completely different from what the 45th president is trying to tell his millions of supporters. And that's what's so dangerous for the country, because so many Americans still continue to believe what Donald Trump is telling them. And in our book, you know, we interviewed more than 140 senior officials in the government, advisors to the former president, witnesses to these events. And again, they told us about how concerned and alarmed they were by what the president was doing and saying in office, especially in those harrowing final weeks after the election and before Joe Biden's inauguration.
So, guys, I'm just having, you know, listening in my mind and imagining that scene of him getting that standing O at Mar-a-Lago, which he gets for himself whenever he wants it, and thinking of Kevin McCarthy going to visit him and these leaders in Washington who follow him, who fear him. And I've made this point before earlier this week. This doesn't feel like a cult. This appears to be a cult. How would you describe the relationship between Trump and his followers, especially given the sort of color that you're telling us about from in your incredible book?
You know, Mika, I'm so glad you fix on that issue of the parade of people that we watched come in to sort of kiss the ring of Donald Trump months after he has, you know, lost the election. So many Republican congressmen are coming to Mar-a-Lago to basically get his endorsement, his stamp of approval, because they know what we all are watching in front of our eyes, that so many Americans still cheer for Donald Trump. As we like to say, you know, if a primary were held today, he would probably be the Republican nominee for president. He is the standard bearer right now and the most prominent Republican. Voters who supported him believe the wall-to-wall basic coverage of his comments and believe that COVID is not as bad as people say because he said so. Believe masks don't work because he rejected them. Believe that the election was stolen because he repeatedly said so and continues to do so.
Guys, congrats on the book. Cannot wait to read it. Carol, one of the pieces that's gotten a lot of attention so far was with the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, and his concerns he had, suggesting that it was this was what was happening in the, after the election before January 20th, akin to Hitler's Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Walk us through, tell us a little more about what he said, what he told others, and what steps perhaps were he and others in the government and the military doing to prevent what Donald Trump wanted to do.
You know, Jonathan, it's such an important moment because it really begins June 1. From our reporting, we learned that General Milley decides after June 1 in that brutal clearing of Lafayette Square for a photo op for the president to look tough, that he is never going to let that happen again. He's never going to be played, as he tells his aides. That won't happen. The military will not be deployed on his watch for a political gain. But he becomes more and more concerned that actually there's a plot afoot. There's a coup in the works. He is warned and gets calls in the middle of the night, as Phil and I learned, from friends, from military aides, from H.R. McMaster, from his mentor, Bob Gates, former defense secretary. Watch it. Something's going on. Here are some of the people you need to be careful about. And he begins meeting with the Joint Chiefs, Army, Navy, Air Force, to talk about what will they do to block Donald Trump if he takes a step to use the military to keep and maintain his grasp on power.